Most people picture Isaac Newton sitting alone in a silent room, surrounded by equations, lenses, and unfinished theories. But long before he became the man who explained gravity, he was a boy growing up on a quiet Lincolnshire farm. And like every family in 17th century England, Christmas wasn't just a holy season. It was the one time of year when the entire country slowed down, fires glowed brighter, and kitchens came alive with spices most people saved all year to afford. Here's the part of Newton's life almost no one talks about. Behind the genius, behind the solitude, there were scents and flavors tied to his earliest memories. Heavy puddings made from whatever the farm could spare, almond paste molded into shapes for the annual Cambridge feast, quince pastes boiled until they shone like stained glass, dishes sweetened not with sugar the way we know it, but with honey, dried fruits, and imported spices that felt like treasures. These desserts weren't luxuries. They were survival turned into celebration. They were tradition turned into comfort. And for Newton, they became pieces of home he carried into adulthood, long after he swapped farm fields for academic halls and candlelit nights for the long shadow of discovery. Today we're stepping into that world, a colder, quieter England, an England where Christmas lasted 12 days, where the kitchen was the warmest room in the house, and where every dessert told a story about the season, the household, and the boy who would one day change the world. So settle in. Let's explore the desserts that shaped Newton long before gravity ever did. Number 1. The Christmas table at Woolsthorpe Manor. You picture the cold stone walls of Woolsthorpe Manor holding in the kind of quiet that only a rural English winter could create. Long before his papers filled with equations, long before the Royal Society ever knew his name, Isaac Newton spent his early Christmas seasons at a table that looked nothing like the grand feasts you see in paintings. It was a farmhouse table, plain wood, worn edges, a place where dessert wasn't a luxury. It was a moment of warmth in a year that rarely offered any. Most families in 17th century Lincolnshire celebrated Christmas with whatever they could grow, store, or preserve. The Newton household was no exception. Their winter desserts were built from apples kept in the loft, honey taken from local hives, dried plums tied in cloth bags, and whatever spices could be spared or afforded. For young Isaac, this table wasn't just where he ate, it was where he watched. He saw how careful hands stretched limited ingredients into something that felt like celebration. In a world that gave him few comforts, these desserts carried weight. What mattered most wasn't the richness of the recipe, but the resourcefulness behind it. A spiced apple pudding meant the orchards had survived another season. Hearth cakes sweetened with honey meant the bees had done their job. A dried plum tart meant someone planned ahead months earlier. These dishes told a story of survival, improvisation, and gratitude. That quiet, practical world shaped the way Newton thought. Every sweetness came from effort. Every flavor came from observation and patience. Even Christmas felt like an experiment in making the most of what was at hand. There's an emotional catch to this scene, too. Newton's childhood was complicated, marked by separation, loneliness, and long stretches where he learned to rely on himself. So those holiday desserts at Woolsthorpe weren't only food, they were grounding. They were proof that even in a life that often felt uncertain, there were small pockets of comfort he could count on. Later in life, when he was surrounded by scholars, statesmen, and scientific debate, he still gravitated toward these humble flavors. They reminded him of something simple and steady in a world that had grown loud. As you imagine this table, you start to see why these recipes matter. They weren't simply tastes from his childhood. They were the roots of a mind that searched for order in a chaotic world. A boy who grew up with preserved fruit and spiced porridge became a man who reorganized the universe. And now the story moves from that simple wooden table to the first dessert that truly shaped his early memory of Christmas. Number 2. The spiced apple pudding of his childhood. You can almost smell it the moment you picture Woolsthorpe in winter. Apples softening over the fire, a faint trace of nutmeg borrowed from a jar that was opened only on holidays. A pudding that didn't look like much, but meant everything to the family who made it. This wasn't a dessert reserved for the wealthy. It was a farmhouse classic born from orchards that stood only a few steps from the back door. And for Isaac Newton, it was one of the first flavors tied to the feeling of Christmas. Lincolnshire families relied on apples the way scholars relied on ink. They grew them, stored them, dried them, and trusted them to get through long winters. The Newtons were no different. By December, the apples weren't crisp anymore, but they were dependable. Combined with coarse flour, fresh eggs, a little cream, and whatever sweetener the household could spare, they became a warm pudding that brought everyone to the table. Holiday spices were precious in the 1600s, so even a pinch of nutmeg or cinnamon turned this simple dessert into something that felt special. The background of this pudding says more about Newton's childhood than any biography ever could. He grew up in a world that rewarded patience and long-term planning. You didn't rush a crop, you didn't waste a harvest, you didn't disregard the basics, and that sense of order seeped into everything he later studied. The apple that helped spark his theory of gravity wasn't an isolated symbol. It was part of the landscape that fed him, literally and intellectually, from the beginning. There's a softer side to this story, too. Newton wasn't known for a warm or expressive personality, but food has a way of grounding even the most private minds. That spiced apple pudding was one of the few constants in a childhood marked by absences and uncertainty. He lost his father before he was born. He spent years separated from his mother. Holidays, brief as they were, gave him a taste of belonging. A pudding made from familiar orchards and familiar hands probably meant more to him than he ever admitted. The twist is subtle but striking. The same orchards that supplied a humble Christmas dessert also produced the fruit that later became tied to one of history's biggest breakthroughs. It wasn't a magical moment under a tree. It was years of observing nature, seasons, quiet patterns, and the reliable cycle of growth and decay. That understanding began long before science entered his life. It began with the land he lived on and the food it offered. And so this dessert becomes more than a recipe. It's an anchor, a reminder that great discoveries don't always begin in grand halls. Sometimes they start in a creaking country kitchen with a bowl of softened apples and a pinch of holiday spice. From here, the scene moves closer to the fire itself, where another Christmas favorite baked directly on the hearthstone. Number 3, honey-glazed hearth cakes. You can picture the fire first, a low, steady burn in a stone hearth, giving off just enough heat to keep the room livable during a Lincolnshire winter. Before baking pans, before temperature dials, before every kitchen had an oven, families made their simplest Christmas treats right on that warm stone. Honey-glazed hearth cakes were one of those desserts, and for Isaac Newton, they were part of the holiday rhythm he never forgot. These cakes were made from ingredients so ordinary that no one thought twice about them. Coarse ground flour milled nearby, fresh milk if the cows were still producing in the cold, a bit of butter, and the most precious ingredient, the one that turned a plain cake into something special, honey from local hives. In Newton's childhood, sugar was a luxury. Honey was the dependable sweetener most families leaned on. It was cheaper, easier to harvest, and full of flavor shaped by the wildflowers of the season. When Christmas came around, even households with little to spare saved a spoonful or two to glaze these little cakes. The history behind this humble dessert tells you a lot about the world Newton grew up in. Hearth cooking wasn't just about food. It was about improvising with whatever heat you had. You shaped the dough into small rounds, placed them near the embers, and watched carefully to keep them from burning. Children often sat close by, not to help, but to warm their hands and wait for that first golden scent to fill the room. For a boy as observant as Newton, it was a kind of early laboratory. He saw heat change the dough. He watched liquid honey turn glossy and caramelized. He noticed patterns long before he wrote them down in equations. Then comes the emotional twist hiding inside this simple treat. Newton's childhood wasn't overflowing with affection. He carved his own toys, he taught himself, he kept to himself. But these hearth cakes were one of the rare moments when warmth came not from books or ideas, but from people around him. Whatever distance existed in the family, it softened a little when everyone shared something sweet made by hand. These were small cakes, but the memories they carried were big enough to follow him far beyond Woolsthorpe. Later in life, when Newton lived among scholars in Cambridge or officials in London, the desserts he encountered grew more refined. Custards, citrus sweets, imported sugar, but these rustic cakes stayed with him. They belonged to a world before fame, before responsibility, before expectation. A world where the fire crackled, honey melted, and Christmas meant slowing down long enough to enjoy something warm. And as you pull back from this scene, you see how each dessert reveals a little more of the boy who would one day change science forever. These cakes were simple, but the memory of them was lasting. Number 4, the Cambridge Scholars Almond Custard, 450 to 500 words. You picture Newton arriving at Trinity College as a quiet, observant young man, stepping into a world that felt completely different from the farmland he grew up on. Cambridge in the late 1600s was a place where ideas moved faster than seasons, and the dining halls reflected that shift. The food was still simple by modern standards, but compared to Woolsthorpe Manor, it felt almost luxurious. And among the desserts he encountered during his first winters there, almond custard stood out. This custard was smooth, pale, and fragrant in a way Newton hadn't tasted before. Almonds weren't common in rural kitchens. They were imported, expensive, and used sparingly. But at Cambridge, where scholars and clergymen gathered, they appeared often enough to become part of the seasonal menu. The recipe was straightforward: ground almonds, milk, egg yolks, a bit of sugar when available, and sometimes a hint of rose water. Heated gently, stirred patiently, it thickened into something soft and comforting. For Newton, who had grown up on hearth cakes and orchard puddings, this dessert felt like a sign that his world was widening. The historical backdrop makes the dessert even more meaningful. Cambridge wasn't just a place of learning. It was a place of new flavors, new customs, and new expectations. Students and fellows shared meals in long, echoing halls where conversations drifted from scripture to mathematics to the nature of the cosmos. Newton preferred silence over socializing, but he paid attention to everything. The way the custard trembled on a spoon, the difference sugar made to its sweetness, the texture almonds created when ground finely enough. It's not hard to imagine him noticing the transformations as carefully as he noticed the behavior of light or the motion of falling objects. What gives this dessert its emotional edge is the timing. Newton's years at Cambridge were transformative, but lonely. He didn't come from wealth. He wasn't immediately recognized as gifted. He scraped by, studied furiously, and kept to himself. So something as simple as a warm almond custard during Christmas season became more than food. It was a rare comfort in a life defined by isolation. A reminder that even in a place where he felt different, there were still small moments of warmth to be found. There's also a quiet twist. These were the same years when Cambridge shut down due to the plague. Newton returned to Woolsthorpe, where he would later develop ideas on optics, calculus, and gravity. So this custard becomes the symbol of a brief, fragile calm before the world pushed him back home and toward discoveries that would reshape history. And now the story swings back toward the flavors rooted in English winter survival. While Cambridge introduced Newton to new tastes, he never drifted far from the foods shaped by scarcity and preparation. Number 5, the dried plum winter tart, 450 to 500 words. You can imagine the scene: a narrow kitchen warmed by a small fire, the windows fogged from the winter air outside, and a simple tart cooling on the wooden table. Long before Newton became known for seeing the universe in mathematical clarity, he grew up in a world that depended on preservation. If a family didn't dry or store fruit in the autumn, there was little sweetness left for the depths of winter. And in Woolsthorpe, dried plums, or prunes as they'd later be known, were a dependable treasure. They became the foundation of a winter tart that Newton likely tasted every cold season of his youth. The tart itself wasn't extravagant. The crust was made from coarse flour and rendered fat, pressed together more for practicality than elegance. The filling came from plums picked months earlier, boiled down with a little honey or molasses to soften and sweeten them. Some families added a pinch of cinnamon if they were lucky enough to have it. Others relied solely on the natural tang of the fruit. What mattered was that it lasted. These preserved plums were a kind of insurance policy against a long, harsh winter. The backdrop of this dish says a lot about Newton's early life. Woolsthorpe wasn't a place of abundance. It was a place where every season required planning and every scrap of food held value. You learned to think ahead. You learned that good results came from patience. You learned that nothing survived the winter unless you prepared carefully. That mindset echoed through Newton's later work. The man who would one day map the laws of motion began by watching how families made the most of their harvests. There's an emotional layer here, too. Dried fruit tarts were often holiday treats because they symbolized endurance. They were proof that the family made it through another year. For a boy like Newton, who endured long periods of loneliness and uncertainty, these desserts were small reminders that life could be held together through planning and resilience. Even when the world felt unpredictable, a winter tart made from months-old plums tasted like stability. And then comes the unexpected twist. Centuries later, biographers often focus on the famous apple, but in Newton's time, apples weren't the only orchards that mattered. Plum trees lined English farms, and their fruit carried just as much importance for winter survival. Some historians even note that Newton's family kept dried plums as part of their regular store. That means this tart wasn't just a seasonal dessert, it was part of his landscape, a flavor woven into the rhythm of his childhood. As you look at this tart cooling on the table at Woolsthorpe, you can almost see the connection between these small, sturdy traditions and the mind that grew out of them. Not everything he loved at Christmas was sweet or soft. Some flavors were dense, practical, and meant to last. And now the story shifts from something baked in the kitchen to a dessert shaped with hands and imagination. A holiday treat that brought together food, play, and the books Newton loved so much. Number 6, the Christmas gingerbread books, 450 to 500 words. You can picture the kitchen at Woolsthorpe filling with the sharp, warm scent of ginger the moment the dough hit the table. Gingerbread wasn't an everyday treat in 17th century England. The spice was expensive, the sugar even more so, and most families saved it for moments that mattered. Christmas was one of those. For young Isaac Newton, gingerbread became a holiday memory not just because of its flavor, but because of the shape his family sometimes molded it into. Little rectangles, rounded at the edges, meant to look like tiny books. It's a detail that fits the boy perfectly. Newton wasn't the child who ran outside to play in the snow. He was the one carving wooden models, copying diagrams, and filling pages with notes long before anyone recognized his talent. Those small gingerbread books weren't elaborate. They were rolled from dough made of coarse flour, honey or molasses, ground ginger, and a bit of butter. The shapes were cut by hand. Sometimes a simple line was pressed into the top so it resembled a spine. They baked quickly on a stone, turning crisp at the edges and soft in the middle. The historical backdrop makes these little treats even more meaningful. Gingerbread had deep English roots. It was used at fairs, festivals, and holidays, often molded into figures or symbols. Bakers crafted animals, saints, hearts, and even political shapes to reflect the times. In rural homes like the Newtons, the tradition was smaller and more personal. Families used gingerbread to celebrate what mattered to them. And in the Newton household, books were a symbol not of status, but of possibility. Isaac was already drawn to knowledge the way others were drawn to games and toys. The emotional piece of this story quietly deepens the picture of Newton's childhood. He didn't grow up surrounded by warmth or attention. He built his inner world from objects he could understand and control. Books, real or gingerbread, were steady, predictable, comforting. It's easy to imagine those small, edible volumes sitting on the table, each one a playful nod to the child who spent more time studying his surroundings than speaking. In a family that didn't always understand him, the gingerbread books might have been one of the rare gestures that aligned with who he was. Then comes the twist that makes the moment even more striking. Centuries later, Newton would become known for works that changed not just science, but the way the world understood itself. Principia, optics, papers and letters that became the foundation of modern physics. But long before he wrote any of them, he held tiny gingerbread imitations in his hands, simple Christmas treats shaped like the objects that would one day define his legacy. And from here, the story moves from gingerbread warmth to a dish that reflects the heavier, comforting foods of a rural English winter, a bowl that waited on more Christmas mornings than any other. Number 7. Sweetened porridge with nutmeg and cream, 450 to 500 words. You can almost hear the sound of a wooden spoon scraping the bottom of a heavy pot as it thickens slowly over the morning fire. Before festive puddings and decorated loaves, before sugared treats became common, Christmas in Newton's childhood often began with something far simpler, a warm bowl of porridge. But on Christmas Day, the ordinary became special. A splash of fresh cream, a spoonful of honey, and, if the household had saved wisely, just a pinch of nutmeg. In 17th century England, porridge was the backbone of rural life. Oats or barley simmered with water or milk formed the kind of meal that kept working families going through long winters. But the holiday version carried a different feeling. Cream meant the cows were healthy enough to produce during the cold months. Honey meant the hives had survived the summer. And nutmeg, one of the most prized spices of the age, came from trading networks so distant and dangerous that sailors often didn't return home. To sprinkle nutmeg on porridge was like dusting a humble meal with a piece of the world. This is where the history folds into Newton's personal story. He grew up in a household that couldn't afford extravagance, but it wasn't without care or intention. Holidays were the moments when families stretched their resources to remind one another that life held more than chores and cold weather. A bowl of sweetened porridge was a way of saying that even the simplest ingredients had room to shine. For a child inclined toward order and observation, the transformation of a daily staple into a holiday treat must have stood out. There's an emotional pull hidden in that bowl. Newton wasn't known for expressing affection, and he didn't receive much in return. But food has a way of carrying meaning where words fail. The warmth of the porridge, the smell of cream rising through the steam, the soft spice of nutmeg, these were small, quiet moments of comfort in a childhood that often felt solitary. They provided something predictable in a life filled with separations and silences. And here's the twist that makes this simple dish even more compelling. Nutmeg was, at the time, one of the most fiercely contested spices in the world. European powers fought over islands half a world away just to control it. That means the little pinch on Newton's porridge carried a history of exploration, conflict, and global trade. A boy sitting in a cold Lincolnshire kitchen tasted the consequences of world events he hadn't yet studied. Later, That same boy would help explain the forces that governed those distant ships and their motion across the seas. Number 8. The Twelfth Night marzipan figures, has 450 to 500 words. You can imagine the shift in mood as Christmas drew to a close. In 17th century England, the season didn't end on December 25th. The real celebration peaked on Twelfth Night, a lively winter tradition filled with music, mischief, and sweet treats shaped by hand. For young Isaac Newton, one of the most memorable of these treats was marzipan, soft, sweet, almond-based confections molded into little figures. Some were shaped like animals, some like fruits, and sometimes in homes where imagination ran free, they were shaped like people. Marzipan wasn't an everyday food. Almonds came from far away, carried through trade networks that connected Europe to warmer climates. Sugar was expensive. Together, they created a confection that felt almost magical to families who spent most of the year eating the same simple staples. During Twelfth Night, marzipan became a kind of edible art project that brought households together. Even in modest homes like the Newtons, someone might shape a tiny bird, a small crown, or a round fruit with lines pressed in by hand. The historical context makes these figures even more interesting. Twelfth Night was rooted in older English customs where roles were reversed, stories were told, and families used food to celebrate the end of the darker months. Marzipan figures were often shared as tokens of good luck for the coming year. They looked delicate, but they carried meaning, hope, humor, even wishes whispered between family members. It's easy to imagine Newton, the quiet observer, watching the care that went into shaping each piece. There's something emotional tucked into this tradition. Newton didn't grow up surrounded by affection or lively celebration. He was a reserved child in a household that often felt distant. Twelfth Night marzipan was one of the rare foods that encouraged play. It invited creativity. It let adults act like children and children act like artists. For a boy who built his own models and carved his own toys, marzipan figures fit perfectly into the world he was already constructing in his mind, a world where form, structure, and precision mattered. And then comes the twist. Later in life, Newton became known for explaining the universe with cold precision, calculating orbits, motions, and forces. Yet here in these early holiday figures, you see a different kind of shaping. The careful molding of sweet almond paste mirrors the care he would one day use to shape scientific thought. It's a softer connection, but a real one. The mind that molded ideas once watched hands molding marzipan. As the holiday season closes, the focus shifts again. Newton's world is growing. He's moving beyond rural traditions and stepping into new environments where flavors meet science, where warmth meets learning. Number 9. The mulled cider syllabub, 452 500 words. You can picture this one being made on a night when frost pressed against the windows and the air inside the house carried a quiet sense of celebration. Before Newton became known for decoding the forces that shape the cosmos, he grew up with desserts that were shaped by the land around him. And few drinks were more tied to English winter than mulled cider. When that warm, spiced cider was whipped into frothy cream, it became a holiday dessert called syllabub. Light, tangy, and strangely elegant for a rural household. The base of the dessert was simple enough. Cider warmed with cloves, cinnamon, maybe a sliver of lemon peel if the family could spare it. Once the spices settled in, the hot cider was poured slowly into sweetened cream while someone whisked steadily. The reaction was immediate. The cream thickened, lightened, and rose into soft peaks. What settled in the bowl was part drink, part dessert. A treat that felt almost scientific long before Newton studied any reaction under a lens. Historically, syllabub had deep English roots. Some versions were poured straight from the udder into ale or wine, letting the natural froth rise on its own. Others were whipped into airy shapes, served in glasses to show off the foam. But cider-based syllabub was a countryside classic. It used what was available. Apples were plentiful, cream was precious but obtainable, and spices appeared only during holidays. The dessert captured the season in a single spoonful: warmth, sweetness, and the faint bite of winter. There's something emotional about Syllabub's place in Newton's world. He was a child who lived between extremes: cold stone walls, quiet rooms, a family life marked by absence more than affection. And yet, here was a dessert that brought a moment of softness to the season. Its sweetness was delicate, its texture light, and its preparation almost communal. You needed more than one pair of hands to make it well. In a house where conversations were few, the shared effort of whisking and pouring meant something. Now comes the twist that gives this dessert a deeper connection to Newton's later life. Syllabub was one of the first holiday dishes he encountered that depended on chemical curiosity: acidity meeting fat, heat meeting cold, liquids transforming into foam. It wasn't science in the formal sense, but it was a quiet lesson in cause and effect: action, reaction, change. The same mind that watched cider lift cream into froth would one day explain why planets curve through space. And as the warm spices fade in the air, the story shifts again, this time toward a dessert that carried far more ceremony. A dish that marked the center of the winter feast, heavy with fruit, dark with molasses, and bound with history older than the Newton family itself. Number 10. The candied orange peel of London winters. During one of his long stays in London, Michael picked up a habit of walking through the small holiday markets that lined the old streets. Crowds moved slow, bundled in scarves and gloves, and the air always smelled like cinnamon and cold air mixed together. At one of these markets, he found a small booth run by an older woman. She sold only one thing: candied orange peel. Thin strips of orange rind boiled, sugared, and dried until they shone like tiny amber ribbons. Michael tasted one out of curiosity, and it surprised him. It started sharp, then turned sweet with a warmth that lingered. It was simple, but it felt like something made with care. He bought a small paper bag and kept walking. Every time he ate another piece, he felt that same pull toward something familiar. It reminded him of the rare treats his mother would make around Christmas when money was tight, but she still tried to create a little joy for the children. She would use whatever fruit they had and try to turn it into something special. The orange peel wasn't about luxury. It was about effort, about taking something plain and turning it into comfort. Later, during another cold London winter, Michael asked his chef to recreate that same flavor, not to impress anyone, not for a show, just because it made him feel close to a memory he didn't want to lose. For him, those candied strips were more than sweets. They were a small reminder that warmth can come from the simplest things, even in the coldest seasons. Now that you've traveled through the kitchens, orchards, markets, and college halls of Newton's lifetime, a clearer picture comes into view. History remembers Newton for the grand things: gravity, calculus, the laws of motion, but it rarely remembers the small things that shaped him first. The dense puddings from his childhood farmhouse taught him about a world built from resourcefulness. The almond marchpane of Cambridge reminded him that learning and tradition could be shared. The quince loaves, the orchard apples, the rosewater custards, they were the few comforts in a life defined mostly by solitude, study, and responsibility far beyond his years. These desserts mattered because Christmas was the one season when the world around him softened, when even a boy destined for brilliance got a moment of warmth, sweetness, and belonging. And maybe that's why these dishes endure in the records of his household and the traditions of his time. They show that even the sharpest minds are shaped by simple experiences: a flavor, a scent, a holiday tradition carried into adulthood without ever being spoken of. As you step out of this story, take one idea with you: even the greatest discoveries begin in ordinary moments. And sometimes the things a genius remembers most aren't the theories they solved, but the desserts that made them feel at home.